Welcome to the deep dive. You provided us with a really crucial stack of analysis today, and it all centers on one very specific incident that our sources are using as a kind of high-fidelity signal, a signal to understand these huge structural shifts between, between economies and political systems.
It's a fascinating case study, and our mission today, as you know, is not to get caught up in the drama of it all.
Right. We're here to apply the analytical framework from your material. It's called the mini core field methodology.
Exactly. Think of the core field framework as let's say, a highly calibrated filter. It's designed to pull out the structural data from all the narrative noise.
So for this deep dive, we're sticking to the rules. We're looking at structure over impression.
And crucially, we're treating any political or social emotion as a gradient. We're not here to judge if the action was right or wrong. We're just examining the objective output signal it sends to the operating systems of the world.
Okay, so let's start with the incident itself, the fact log for this analysis. This all happened in late November 2024.
Right. In Shanghai.
It was a Japanese anime-related live performance. And the key event, the thing that generated all this data, was an abrupt, forced shutdown. The lights and sound were just cut.
Physically cut mid-performance.
And that detail, the forced, immediate physical override, that's the data point that matters most, isn't it?
It is. This wasn't some gentle cancellation announced hours beforehand, no press release. This was an instant physical demonstration of authority overriding a contracted event in real time.
Yep.
With an audience watching.
And of course, this didn't happen in a vacuum. It occurred against a backdrop of already, pretty high political tensions.
Historical disputes, friction over Taiwan, all the usual stuff.
Which had already led to a series of other, maybe quieter, Japan-related cultural cancellations. So what was it about this forced shutdown, the one caught on video, that made it transcend mere friction and become a key indicator for the international?
It was the visibility, the irrefutable evidence. Think of that video footage not as public drama, but as the international system running a stress test.
The stress test.
Yes. It was direct, undeniable proof that political authority could, and did, override contracts instantly, with no immediate recourse. For any external entity, especially corporations whose survival depends on predictability. Well, that video wasn't entertainment.
It was immediately logged as risk logging data.
Precisely. And at the same time, you had this immediate societal resonance.
You saw this huge reaction in neighboring countries.
It triggered a visible and very rapid strengthening of the anti-China gradient in the social operating systems of places like South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. They weren't just reacting to the general politics, they're used to that.
They were reacting to the violation of cultural space.
Exactly. A space they often see as neutral territory. And that violation felt different.
That sets the stage perfectly.
Right.
So let's unpack this using the three critical layers from the framework: narrative, interest, and operational system, the NIOS analysis. We'll start at the surface with the narrative layer, the N layer.
The N layer is always the easiest and fastest thing to see. It's the rapid amplification of political narratives.
The anti-Japan or Taiwan-related messaging that was used as the official justification for the shutdown.
Right. The political OS was using the cultural domain for a display of force to reinforce this idea of an external enemy for domestic consumption, pure narrative management.
But the sources you sent over suggest this political goal came with a very high and maybe unrecognized structural cost.
A profound cost. Because the action itself showed a fundamental structural misreading of what cultural space even means within liberal societies.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in those societies, cultural activity is often treated as a low-friction neutral zone. It's built on assumed mutual trust, on contractual autonomy.
So by intervening politically and physically in that specific space,
They touched a foundational cultural membrane, a membrane that, for external observers, should be sacrosanct. This turned what was intended as a simple political signal into a much more serious structural violation.
Okay, so if the narrative was flawed because it broke that critical membrane, the next question is about who actually gained or lost from it. Let's move to the interest layer, the I layer, the diverging interests.
And here we see three very distinct sets of interests just smashing into each other. First, you have the internal dynamics, the local political OS actors.
This is where that concept of loyalty competition comes in. It doesn't sound like malice. It sounds more like, like structural pressure.
It's precisely that. This disruption was largely the outcome of an intense internal loyalty competition. The local official, the one who pulls the plug, isn't reacting primarily to the Japanese event itself.
They're reacting to the risk of not acting strongly enough.
Exactly. The micro-incentive is crystal clear. The risk of being seen as insufficiently loyal to the central political mandate, which could damage your career, that risk is way higher than the risk of upsetting a few foreign companies.
So it's an overreaction, a calculated overreaction to stay on the safe side.
It's an internal pressure that causes a massive external rupture. So that's the first interest. Then you have the second, the external actors, the corporate OS.
How do they log this?
For them, for foreign firms all over the world, that video footage was just logged as long-term evidence, evidence of contractual risk. They don't treat it emotionally. It's pure analytics.
It's just a clean data point.
A very clean data point. It proves that the local operational calculus is completely subordinate to an unpredictable, fast-moving political will, and that instantly raises the structural cost of doing business there.
And the third interest group, the regional societies.
Yeah.
They're logging this differently again.
Yes. The really long-term impact comes from them. South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. Their reaction was rooted in the cultural intervention itself. It validated all their existing anxieties about autonomy and control.
So it just strengthens the pre-existing anti-China societal gradients across the whole region.
And it makes future low-friction exchange exponentially harder.
Which brings us to the bedrock of this analysis, the part that matters most for global trade, the operational system, or OS layer. What does this incident really mean for the underlying infrastructure of contracts and predictability?
The international OS, at its core, prioritizes two things above everything else: predictability and contractual integrity.
So the specific political reason, the anti-Japan sentiment, that's just noise to this OS.
It doesn't matter to this system. It's irrelevant. The OS simply logs the outcome. And the outcome was an unpredictable seizure and shutdown of contracted assets.
So the system registers the forced shutdown as a high-fidelity OS non-compatibility signal.
A textbook case. A compatibility error. The system registers a high-risk structure where political will can instantly veto market commitments, and the calculation for foreign investment immediately shifts.
It shifts from, is my contract enforceable in their courts, to something much more corrosive. To the question, can my contract be instantly invalidated by an external non-market political force at any moment? And that changes everything. That's the structural answer. And that shift in perceived risk is lasting. Now, this is where the analysis gets really interesting, really technical. We have to look at the difference in speeds, the shear between these systems. How do we define the different velocity layers that created this fracture?
You can break it down into three primary speed layers. The fast layer is the Chinese political OS.
Immediate response, rapid narrative enforcement.
Right. Local political action, censorship, physical intervention, it all moves at the speed of command.
And you have the medium layer.
That's things like foreign investment cycles, quarterly earnings reports, formal diplomatic statements, market adjustments. It moves at the speed of bureaucracy and capital.
And the final layer, the slow layer. That's the bedrock, isn't it? The hardest to shift.
That's the deepest layer, the societal OS and the underlying value OS. This is long-term trust, cultural affinity, core beliefs about freedom and control, generational attitudes.
Things that shift over decades, maybe even centuries.
Exactly. Generational trust surveys, basically.
Yeah. So the structural fault, the shear crack, is what happens when that fast political OS forces an immediate, sharp overwrite onto the slow cultural and international OS.
And that creates immense friction, sheer heat. The political system is demanding an instantaneous alignment that the deep cultural and market systems simply cannot deliver. When you force that kind of change on a slow-moving system, you don't get obedience.
You get a permanent structural fracture.
Yeah.
Non-compatibility.
That's the crack.
The sources also pointed to another really fascinating and kind of alarming element after the incident. The silence. They called it calcification, the hardening of the membrane.
Yes, the absence of protest.
Why is that silence from major European cultural institutions, from big international entertainment bodies?
Yeah.
Why is that so significant?
The silence is critical because it's so unusual for the global cultural sector. Normally, they're very vocal.
So it's not approval. It's not even apathy.
It's interpreted as strategic cooling distance, acute risk management. It signifies the rapid hardening or calcification of the cultural membranes surrounding any interaction with China.
So the global cultural system is basically saying?
It's saying, the political volatility is too high, the risk of intervention is too acute, so we're going to take a zero contact or minimum contact policy to avoid getting entangled. They're moving the risk off the cultural P&L sheet and onto the political risk sheet.
And that strategic withdrawal, that calcification, it ensures a long-term degradation of trust. The global cultural infrastructure just decides that engagement carries unmanageable political risk,
Hmm.
which leads to this quiet, long-term divestment.
Exactly right. In this context, silence is a very powerful form of structural rejection.
Let's dig into the core incompatibility here,
Hmm.
what the sources call the compatibility error.
Hmm.
What was the triad of non-compatible operating systems that collided and made this failure inevitable?
You saw the collision of three systems that are, well, structurally impossible to merge without generating severe friction.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, you have the ideology OS. Its priority is total central control and political unity. The culture OS that's prevalent in liberal societies. That prioritizes autonomy, freedom of expression, mutual trust,
And the third is the international OS.
which demands contractual integrity and predictability as the absolute basis for any market to function.
So cultural intervention, in this context, it's like an automatic OS failure trigger.
It's guaranteed. The systems have a fundamental disagreement on the rules of engagement. When the ideology OS tries to exert that immediate fast layer control over the slow, deep-seated cultural domain, it guarantees a failure state relative to the other two.
And this incompatibility deepens two fault lines at the same time, creating a resonance that just accelerates the rupture. What are those two fault lines?
The first is the visible state-level fault line. That's the structural conflict between an authoritarian OS and a liberal OS, especially around this idea of a cultural non-intervention principle.
And the second one is deeper.
Much deeper. It's the societal level fault line, the growing separation between a controlled society and societies that are conditioned by and expect freedom and autonomy.
The danger is the resonance between them.
That's the key. When these two fault lines resonate, when the political control validates the societal anxieties, they just feed off each other. The overall structural division, both politically and socially, widens at an accelerated, persistent pace. It becomes independent of the original event.
So let's shift to the forward-looking calculation. We've analyzed the structure, the fracture mechanics.
Yeah.
What's the lasting knowledge, the residual value that the international system has logged from this?
Well, for the corporate side, this data acts as a critical accelerant. It speeds up existing foreign corporate withdrawal decisions.
It moves withdrawal from just a strategic option to a structural necessity.
Exactly. It helps define the national credit rating for contractual risk. The perception of risk is now solidified. It's structural, not just cyclical anymore.
And on the geopolitical and social level, what's the proxy layer being used to act out these tensions now?
It accelerates the persistent East Asian value OS polarization. And crucially, the sources show that cultural sectors, anime, music, performance, even video games, are now functioning as a geopolitical proxy layer.
So tensions are acted out there first.
In these relatively low-state spaces, it's a structural friction boundary where the incompatible operating systems clash first without needing an immediate military or high-stakes economic confrontation.
Which makes the cultural domain the most sensitive barometer of structural risk. Let's go back to the ultimate thesis from your sources. The idea that the nation is destroying its own membrane in areas it doesn't understand. Why is that?
This brings us to the missing piece, the meta-OS. The analysis concludes that the system lacks the necessary structural awareness, the meta-OS, to perceive the full scope of the damage it's inflicting on its own soft power and its own contractual trust.
So it's not that they're indifferent to the damage. It's that they are structurally incapable of fully processing the long-term low-speed feedback from this OS non-compatibility.
Precisely. They're optimizing for fast-layer political unity, and they're doing it at the expense of slow-layer global trust. They simply lack the system architecture to calculate the real cost of that trade-off, and so they accelerate the rupture.
That summary, the high-speed political OS forcing an overwrite on low-speed global value systems, really brings it all home. The relevance isn't the show cancellation, it's the creation of this persistent non-compatibility.
And the structural data points logged here will influence market decisions long after the political motivations of that moment have faded. The international OS registered a fundamental failure in predictability, and that memory is extremely long-term.
And that leaves us with a provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. We've seen the cultural membrane as hardening. We've seen that strategic silence is the key reaction. So what happens when this calcification starts affecting the high-speed OS layers? We're talking about things like technology transfer, critical intellectual property flows, or even access to major financial markets. What degree of friction heat might the next shear crack generate when those Much faster, more financially critical systems clash with that same immovable value OS.
It's the next logical and I think highly concerning step in this whole structural analysis. And the implications for global interdependence and economic predictability, they're profound.
Thank you for providing the source material for this analytical deep dive. Until next time.